Thank you very much. Those are a lot of questions I'm supposed to answer this evening. What to do with a thing like the nation. Thank you all for coming out on a cold evening. What I want to do with you is to discuss the longevity of this book. It is now, 3.5 decades since the book appeared, and it is still counting as a benchmark in the field, and that is very unusual. In 2006, for the new edition, Anderson himself pointed out that maybe it remained fresh because it hadn't really been accepted and gone mainstream in nationalism studies. As he said, the idiosyncratic method and preoccupations of imagined communities seem to me still on the margins of the newer scholarship of nationalism, and in that sense, at least, not fully superseded. It's still a bit of a challenge of a book. It still comes from left field. It still makes you go, but the effect has changed because things like the fall of communism happened. And for a card-carrying leftist Western Marxist like Anderson, that, is a bit of an incisive event. So what I want to do with you today is roughly 4 parts. I have been asked by Studium Generale to bring in an autobiographical note and to reflect on what the book meant to me. And I'm old enough to remember it coming out, so I have a head start on you there. And that also meant that I was very young and inexperienced when I read the book, so I might have got it wrong all the time, but so you can catch me out on that one. So I'll try and time travel back to what it was like in 1983 when the book came out, and what the situation was of cultural studies. I come from comparative literature, that is to say from the cultural end of the humanities rather than from the political or sociological end. And I will sort of explain to you how I read imagined communities at the time. And then I'll reflect a little bit on how the book impacted on the tradition of nationalism studies, which was not my own tradition. And in the final part of this chat, I'll be offering a few thoughts. What was it in the book, in the actual contents, that was so very inspiring? What are the takeaways for now? What are the things I'd like to highlight? And where do we perhaps have to rethink after 35 years if the book is not slightly getting, needs to be updated to new forms of nationalism that even Benedict Anderson couldn't have predicted at the time. Okay, so to go back to 1983, I hope that this is not too small to read. It's just, 3 years that I try to evoke in a number of political and cultural things, and it's basically to, give you a flavor of that time, when disappointed hippies meeting the digital world. In 1982, the Commodore C64 home computer came on the market, and the very first computer virus was designed. The Falklands War happened. The Israeli-Lebanon War happened, leading to the massacres in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. Yuri Andropov succeeded Leonid Brezhnev as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR, and the Polish government banned a grassroots trade union called Solidarity. Michael Jackson released Thriller. Dire Straits released their album Love Over Gold. The movies that came out were Rambo, Rocky III, Blade Runner, The World According to Garp, and Gandhi. And Thomas Keneally won the Booker Prize for Schindler's Ark. Later, the Spielberg movie Schindler's List. In the year itself, 1983, the internet opened. ARPANET went public with IPS addresses. The Hitler diaries, the fake Hitler diaries, were published in Stern. A new disease was recognized, first called homosexual cancer, later known as AIDS. Ronald Reagan unveiled the Strategic Defense Initiative, then called Star Wars. Margaret Thatcher was re-elected by a landslide following the Falkland Wars. David Bowie brought out Let's Dance. The movies of the year were Flashdance, Gorky Park, Independence Day, and The Return of the Jedi. And a book that won the National book prize in America was Alice Walker's The Color Purple. And the next year, the LA Olympics were boycotted by the USSR. There was an assassination attempt on Margaret Thatcher in a Brighton hotel by the IRA. Indira Gandhi was assassinated in revenge for anti-Sikh repression, and Ronald Reagan was re-elected. There was a devastating famine in Ethiopia. Madonna brought out the album Like a Virgin, Bruce Springsteen, born in the USA. The movies of the year: Edgar Wright's Heimat, Wim Wenders' Paris, Texas, Amadeus, Ghostbusters, The Karate Kid, Terminator, and The Passage to India. Marguerite Duras won the Prix Goncourt for L'Amant. That might give you a flavor of the period. For people my age, it might take you right back. You know, others, you say, well, this is this old post-hippie stuff. Throughout these years, post-structuralism was a constant battle between the old generation and the new. The way long hair had been in the 60s, post-structuralism was an ongoing irritant in the 80s. Campus novels like Small World by David Lodge reflect this. Now, what was post-structuralism? I think the best way in which I can give you a flavor of how it had come about out of postmodernism in the 1960s is if I read you a story about a page long from a terrible, terrible long novel called The Magus by John Fowler. Who has read The Magus? Thank God. It sort of defined a feeling of postmodernism, and that, you know, when I was an impressionable undergraduate, I was really floored by this story. It's called The Prince and the Magician. So, 4 screens, bear with me. Once upon a time, there was a young prince who believed in all things but 3. He did not believe in princesses, he did not believe in islands, he did not believe in God. His father, the king, told him that such things didn't exist. As there were no princesses or islands in his father's domains and no sign of God, the prince believed his father. But then, one day, the prince ran away from his palace and came to the next land. There, to his astonishment, from every coast he saw islands, and on these islands strange and troubling creatures whom he dared not name. As he was searching for a boat, a man in full evening dress approached him along the shore. "Are those real islands?" said the young prince. "Of course they're real islands," said the man in evening dress. "And those strange and troubling creatures? They are all genuine and authentic princesses." "Then God must also exist," cried the prince. "I am God," replied the man in evening dress with a bow. The young prince returned home as quickly as he could. "So you're back," said his father, the king. "I have seen islands, I have seen princesses, I have seen God," said the prince reproachfully. The king was unmoved. "Neither real islands, nor real princesses, nor a real God exist." "I saw them." "Tell me how God was dressed." "God was in full evening dress." "Were the sleeves of his coat rolled back?" The prince remembered that they had been. The king smiled. "That is the uniform of a magician. You have been deceived." The prince returned to the next land and went to the same shore, where once again he came upon the man in full evening dress. "My father, the king, has told me who you are," said the prince indignantly. "You deceived me last time, but not again. Now I know that those are not real islands and real princesses, because you are a magician." The man on the shore smiled. "It is you who are deceived, my boy. In your father's kingdom there are many islands and many princesses, but you are under your father's spell, so you cannot see them." The prince pensively returned home. When he saw his father, he looked him in the eye. "Father, is it true that you're not a real king, only a magician?" The king smiled and rolled back his sleeves. "Yes, my son, I am only a magician." "Then the man on the other shore was God." The man on the other shore was another magician. "I must know the truth beyond magic." "There is no truth beyond magic," said the king. The prince was full of sadness. He said, "I will kill myself." The king, by magic, caused death to appear. Death stood in the door and beckoned the prince. The prince shuddered. He remembered the beautiful but unreal islands and the unreal but beautiful princesses. "Very well," he said, "I can bear it." "You see, my son," said the king, "you too now begin to be a magician." This little exercise in postmodern fiction captures the troubled relationship between appearances and reality, and in a sort of an ironic move beyond existentialism, the relationship between them is seen as something exciting and enabling rather than as an existential angst. And this had been the long-term trajectory of a great tradition of what I will call cultural studies that had begun to come out after the Second World War. And I'm tracing them, a little bit across the year 1983. It is bracketed by two books that are about representation, how we represent the world. In 1946, Erich Auerbach had brought out his book Mimesis, Die dargestellte Wirklichkeit in der abendländischen Literatur, on representations. And in 1997, right at the end, Stuart Hall brought out a book called Representation. And between that, everybody was reflecting on how meaningful are representations, and is there anything beyond the representation that we can really believe in? Marshall McLuhan had said that the medium is the message in the Gutenberg Galaxy in 1962. Claude Lévi-Strauss, Le Cru et le Cuit, pointed out that we cannot even name the things that are outside our experience. In societies where food is never cooked, there is no word for raw because everything is raw, and so there's no word for it, and people are sort of locked up without being able to name the very thing that defines them. Michel Foucault, Les mots et les choses, more or less the same thing. Hayden White, Metahistory, 1973, says, historians do not narrate the past, they construct the past. Their stories shape the way in which we view it. Edward Said in Orientalism looked at the way in which representations of the Orient had formed part of the power politics and of the artistic imagination of the West. Hugo Düsserink in Comparatistic, the tradition that I come from, had put the notion of national stereotyping centrally on the agenda of literary history. The invention of tradition, the idea that the past might be, given to you by a magician rather than God, to stay in the John Fowler things, came out in 1983, same year as Benedict Anderson. Les lieux de mémoire, Nora, Raoul Girardet, Mythe et mythologie politique, Stuart Hall representation. All this, what I want to boil this down to, is that what used to be an essentialist idea of culture as the mirror to something real, a window on real truths, real facts, real situations out there, and culture as emanating from a collective temperament, that was what we would now call deconstructed. The word wasn't yet there, but that, they said there is no God and no real islands, but we might as well behave as if there are, because that's how the world works. And so we came to a communicative idea of culture as a social praxis producing meaning rather than reflecting meaning. All of us becoming magicians as a result of culture, rather than having to learn what God meant by creating culture. This is the tradition that I came out of, and that most people in the humanities came out of in the 70s and 80s. And that was me. I had done an MA in comparative literature in Aachen, finished in 1979, in the specialism called imagology. It's a horrible word, I'm not going to talk about it. There's a website there, and it's about national stereotypes and cultural stereotypes, and how people believe that the Germans are profound and serious, and the French are frivolous and oh la la, and the Dutch are ill-mannered, and that this somehow defines us. And so, again, these are representations, and you can study them. I was applying this to Irish nationalism, and I had tried to see to which extent Irish nationalism was based on a self-image of Irish identity. And I had first done this in Dublin, and then I moved to Toronto, where I was exposed to poststructuralism, the sort of stuff I've just been talking about, and I realized nations too are like islands and princesses. They're probably not real, but people behave as if they are. They are what we now call constructs. And of course, against that background, imagined communities hit me like a flash. This guy is really onto it, he absolutely has a thing. And so I misread the title. And I wasn't the only one to do so, because the German translation that came out in 1988 was called Die Erfindung der Nation. So the nation as a figment of the imagination. Imagined communities meaning something, once upon a time there was something that we will call them. In fact, my hunch is that if Anderson would have written the book 20 years later, he would have called it virtual communities. That it has to do with a sense of community that is spread through shared communication, and that it projects, that creates a fellow feeling between people who aren't actually there. So I think the title is a bit ambivalent, but I read it in this sort of post-structuralist, anti-essentialist way. The nation is a construct. And if you want to understand the nation, you have to see what it sets itself off again. Who is the famous excluded other? So in order to understand masculinity, you have to know what men think about women. If you want to understand who the Dutch are, you have to understand what we think about the Belgians, the Germans, etc. And it's this contradistinction that produces identity. This is what I was trying to do in Ireland. So it worked for me. And so I met the Andersons. The Andersons came from a wholly different tradition. They came from upper-class English Marxism, very specific kind of stuff. There was a lot of that. The Fabian Society, George Bernard Shaw. They had both. There were two brothers, Cain and Abel, Perry and Dominic. Both of them famous and both of them leading left-wing intellectuals. Perry and Benedict had both been educated in Eton. That sort of gives you an idea what background they come from. Perry had gone on to Oxford, and Benedict had gone on to Cambridge. So, elite. But they had both turned communist in the 50s in their education, and they followed a great tradition in that. And among British intellectuals, there was Raymond Williams and E.P. Thompson, and they were in good company. But they weren't quite in the mainstream. They left England. Benedict had been born in Kunming in China. They were a much more roaming global family. Perry made most of his career in America, even though he founded the New Left Review, very important, socialist think tank journal, and was a very frequent contributor to the August London Review of Books. But he was more or less institutionally based at UCLA in Los Angeles. Benedict gravitated to Cornell, but he was very much a theoretician of Southeast Asia. He'd done a lot of work on Indonesia, and he kept on doing that until he was actually banned from entering the country because he was too left-wing for the taste of the authorities there. But for Benedict Anderson, the main thing that he wanted to make sense of in his left-wing view of a decolonizing world. Remember, this is the Cold War. After the Vietnam War, American imperialism has been defeated by the working classes of Southeast Asia. This is how the communists would see it. And then the working classes of Southeast Asia start warring amongst themselves. A war between Vietnam and China, a war between Vietnam and Cambodia. And Anderson says, what? Won't you please, the Americans are gone? And so he tries to theorize this problem that the anti-imperial struggle is suddenly taken over by an internal, culturally, ethnically based struggle. He had seen the same thing happen in Indonesia. So this is really what drove Benedict Anderson towards thinking about the forces underneath the economy that drive national identity and national mobilization, nationalistic mobilization. So that's a very, very different source tradition than what I came from. And it's a very different source tradition from the Magus or Claude Lévi-Strauss or all those, postmodern, post-structuralist, culturalist. This is a man who believes as Marx. You know, first is the food and then comes the thought. We have the basis in economic reality and then we have time for culture. And suddenly he says, well, maybe it's not quite like that. And he goes through a type of turn. So how did I read Imagined Communities as a graduate student, you know, working on a PhD thesis, looking at this man whose background I didn't understand at all? To give my last autobiographical thing, I had studied in Aachen in the 70s. This was the time of Baader-Meinhof. I had been part of left-wing politics, but left-wing politics in Aachen, I mean, there were 15 warring communist parties, the Chinese, the Albanians, the East Germans, the K-groepen, as they were known in Germany. And I thought, you know, Western Marxist in the British sense was a little silly. I had no rapport with that. So how did I read Imagined Communities? Well, in my interpretation, I thought Anderson meant nations are figments of the imagination, an ideal. But, in the sense of John Farrell's The Magus, this imagined ideal produces meaning and has gained traction in the real world. People have believed in this ideal. It has mobilized them. They have actually done things with it. They have become magicians, if you like. There's no God behind the nation, but there are a lot of magicians of the nation. And we can trace this traction historically. And in my work on Ireland, I worked out a timeline that was fairly close to that of Benedict Anderson. The process begins to accelerate in the 1760s and dominates politics from the 1860s onwards. And that chimed very closely with the type of thing that Anderson was working on. So, nationalism has a short history and a long memory, because they're always thinking back of the Middle Ages, the old Celts, you know, Michiel de Ruiter, the Battle of Agincourt, that sort of stuff, you know, and all that is part of the celebration of the nation. But the fact that we celebrate this stuff is really a very modern thing. The history of nationalism goes back much less far than the memory of the nation. And it begins in culture. It begins with what I would call images, and from culture it moves to politics. And this was something that was very, very unusual in mainstream nationalism at the time. So I would give myself a 7, 7.5. And to some extent, you know, I responded to what was really in the book. To some extent, I projected my own ideas on it. But the point, some of the bullet points here were really what made Anderson's book different in nationalism studies. So, let's go away from me and away from the cultural post-hippies to the hardcore of nationalism studies. What was the field that Anderson's book really intervened in? Not some graduate student in Toronto, but really the background that he came from. The 3 pictures I've put up here are the buildings of the New School for Social Research in New York, the New School for short. That's on the left. There's now a new campus there, a shiny new. This was the one that was built in the 1930s. And on the right, there is at the top the London School of Economics, and below that Chatham House, where the Royal Institute for International Affairs is domiciled. Now, between these 3 institutions, most of the leading theories of nationalism had been formulated in a tradition that goes across the 20th century, and where you know, Anderson really came in from left field. It goes back really to the Treaty of Versailles. A lot of diplomats who had been involved in the treaty negotiations in Paris 1919, and there wasn't, of course, just Versailles, there was also Trianon and Sèvres and the others, were basically carving up all the empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Hohenzollern Empire, and making nation states out of them, you know, the self-determination of peoples, applying nationalism in real shaping of the map. A lot of diplomats had been worried about that. It didn't take the rise of Hitler to demonstrate that maybe this system was not very sustainable, that to map states onto nations sounds like a good idea, but will run into terrible practical problems in the real world, because to take just straightforward, benign examples. What is the border between Germany and Denmark? Schleswig-Holstein has a mixed population. In the north of Schleswig-Holstein at the time, 51% of the population spoke Danish and 49% spoke German. But further down, the percentages were reversed. Where do you draw the border? Well, a lot of people said, let's have a referendum. There were lots of referendums in Denmark, in Steiermark in Austria, in Polish borderlands, and people voted where they wanted to belong. But there were a lot of border frictions, and a lot of people who'd lost the war, who saw their empires dismembered, couldn't really hack it. The Hungarians are still choking at the fact that they've lost Transylvania and Slovakia, because a lot of Hungarians live there. This continues to irk. And these borders between nation states, a lot of diplomats already realized this in around 1920, is asking for troubles. In my, I have a little bumper sticker for that to say, if you draw borders, you create borderline cases. And the borders that were drawn in Versailles created a lot of borderline cases in southern Tyrol, all around Europe, and nowhere worse than in the Middle East, where the oil played into things. And the new state of Iraq, 100 years later, is still one of the main problems in the world. People like Carlton Hayes and Carlisle McCartney were already reflecting on this. How is this going to work? And that only got worse with the rise of new nationalistic ideologies in the 1920s, 30s. Maybe a little side comment at this point. When we think of what happened in the 1920s and 30s, we think of a couple of dictators. We think of Hitler and Mussolini, maybe Franco, and Stalin, of course, from a different type of ideology. And then we hear how Poland and Lithuania and Estonia and all these countries that had got their independence in Paris in 1919 lost their freedom, their liberty, and their independence because they were crushed between these two dictatorships. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not the case. In the 1920s and 1930s, all those countries, with one or two exceptions, lost their independence to themselves. They all of them abandoned parliamentary rule. They all of them went for strongman autocratic leaders. In Poland, there was General Pilsudski, who was sort of the Francisco Franco or the Salazar of Poland. Every country in Central Europe installed a sort of dictator to take care of their own affairs around 1930. And when Hitler and Stalin came, the countries were there, but they were no longer democracies. And if we think about the problem of, the democracies in Europe nowadays, it's well to remember the fact that a lot of countries abandoned their own democratic system before the World War arrived. And people saw this happen, and people were worked up about it. Metaxas in Greece, Horthy in Hungary, all these dictators rising up left, right, and center, and the worst of all, of course, Hitler. So, they wanted to see what this problematic ideology was that was surviving the First World War, the Versailles system, the League of Nations. And very important in this respect were two Bohemians, people who came out of the old, what now is called the Czech Republic, the area around Prague. Both of them German speakers. Hans Kohn, a Jew who was also a Zionist, and Karl Deutsch. And both of them were very worried about what was happening. Incidentally, Czechoslovakia was the one country that did not go dictatorial. They were a democracy right up to the moment that Hitler marched in. But, Kohn and Deutsch then fled to America. And they, from their position in Prague, had been reflecting on what was going on. They were at the new school. That was the American thing. And in the London School of Economics, there was another refugee, if you like, Eli Kaduri, a Jew born in Iraq, a new country that was not kind to its Jewish population. And he had fled from anti-Semitism in Iraq. This was the generation that from the Second World War was reflecting on nationalism. And from there, we have an ongoing tradition with names like Hugh Seaton Watson, a neglected great man who was of big influence on Benedict Anderson. Look at the footnotes of Anderson and you see Seaton Watson all over the place. And then the famous names, Ernest Gellner and Anthony Smith, and more latterly, Eric Hobsbawm, who tried to give a Marxist explanation of nationalism, and who was the first to point out the new force of religious fundamentalism. Because the one thing that happened in the middle of the Cold War, even before Benedict Anderson published Imagined Communities, was the fact that the Shah of Iran was kicked out by the Muslim opposition in his own countries, and the Ayatollah was installed. And suddenly, religion became a mobilizing force. And that was a new thing in the middle of the Cold War. Okay, so that was the field in which Anderson's book intervened, and it was stuck in a rut. And I've given you all this stuff about the magus and essentialism and that sort of stuff to help understand the rut. The rut is what I call gammafication, meaning that it had become very much part of the Gammawetenschap, or the social sciences. The study of nationalism was very much social scientific. It had been started by diplomats and government or semi-government think tanks like Chatham House and the Royal Institute for International Affairs, what we would have in this country as Klingendahl, people who are deeply involved with government policy or in international relations, in political science, in historical sociology. Culture didn't come into it. These people were completely concerned with the role of power and the choices in policy of states pursuing the national interest and how to deal with disaffection. And for that reason, this tradition had totally missed out on postmodernism. Historians don't do postmodern, not the serious one, not the social, political ones. This sort of, what in Dutch they call luchtfietserij, is left to the people who study literature or who do theory. A real historian deals with the fact, is sober, doesn't theorize, doesn't allow models to cloud his judgment. And certainly in the tradition of nationalism studies, there was a big problem that people never had an idea that the nation might have been a construct. It was all about what drives these people, what motivates these people to vote for Hitler. So what are the real sociologically measurable things that drive the rise of modernism as a social or a political factor and ideology? And this was very good to understand the societies, but it did not deal with the nature of nationalism. Because the nature of nationalism as an ideology is that it is based on culture, it invokes the identity of the nation, it's about manifesting the nation's, traditions, the we feeling of a group that recognizes each other culturally, in language, in shared memories, etc. And at the same time, it's a product of modernity. And it was very difficult for this entire tradition. Hans Kohn is an exception, but he was a bit of a lone voice. But most of them had a hard time seeing how something that is about culture could be part of modernity, because they had an essentialist, old-fashioned notion of culture, which had always been there, where Michiel de Ruiter or the Battle of Agincourt, or all those old things were part of culture, and Shakespeare was part of culture, and that you had this distinction between the long history and the short memory. They had no ear for that. So there was a huge difficulty for them to square culture and modernity. And the result was the so-called modernism wars, a dilemma. I'm sorry that the print on the screen is a little small again. I'll talk you to it. There were two schools in nationalism studies that were in a trench war. This trench war was shaping up in the 1980s after Elie Kaduri had left the London School of Economics, and Gellner and Smith were becoming figureheads for the modernistic and the traditionalist view of nationalism. For the modernists, nationalism, so that's on the right. I'm starting on the modernistic column. Nationalism is a modern thing, and it's only after 1800 that the state is based on the template of the nation. Louis XIV didn't do that. Charles V didn't do that. It's only after Napoleon that people want to base the state on the underlying nation. Culture has very little to do with that. Okay, people did culture in their spare time. So after work, they would read a novel by Walter Scott, or they'd listen to an opera by Verdi, but that's something you do in your spare time. That's not the real, intervention that you do in society. Culture is, as the phrase has it, a mirror to society. a passive thing, something you do in your spare time. Nowadays we say culture in this view has no agency. Agency being the power to change the situation. Culture is the smoke that accompanies the fire, but it only, it's an illustration. It doesn't change the situation. It is, in the literal sense of the word, inconsequential. It's there, but as a side product. So why should you study it? Nationalism results, if you want to understand it, from the shifting power relations caused by a modernization process. So the explanatory models are all sociological. Are people educated in their hometown, or do they travel to different places to be educated? This is a big theory of Gellner's. The rising middle classes. All these things, are part of how modernists explain the fact that in 1700 there is no nationalism, and in 1900 it's everywhere. It has to do with modernity. Duh. On the other hand, the traditionalists say, no, nations have always made war amongst each other. The Greeks were fighting against the Persians at the Battle of Thermopylae, 300 Spartans kicking out, I don't know how many, you might have seen the movie. And the greatest irony of history is, of course, that the name of the real badass, tough as nails Spartan general lives on as a brand for Belgian chocolates, Leonidas. If I were a Spartan general, I'd hate to be remembered like that, but this is what happens to the best of us. Greek nationalism goes back to the Spartans against the Persians. Jewish nationalism goes back to the Maccabees, who are described in the books of the Old Testament. The Armenians have really old stories about how they fought against neighboring countries. What is this if not nationalism, the traditionalists say? It's as old as the nation itself. There have always been nations, and they have always asserted their identity and their culture forcefully in something we have to call nationalism. And what was the 80 Years' War of the Dutch against the Spaniards if not a national or even nationalistic uprising? So culture is what defines these nations. The Jews are Jews, the Greek are Greek, the Dutch are Dutch because of some sort of national character. What Savigny called the Volksgeist. That word was coined around 1800. That there is just something in the language, in the inherited traditions, in the lifestyle, in the collective memories, which we'll call culture, which means that people recognize each other. And this is what forms their identity, and this is what they stand tall for. It's always been there. And it has agency. And nationalism results when this culture is asserted antagonistically for the good of the nation. The dilemma, briefly, is this. They're both half right and half wrong, if I want to be apodictic about it. I'll try and be a bit more even-handed in a moment. Yes, culture has agency. But no, nationalism does not go back to the Maccabees and the 300 Spartans. It is not ageless. So, how do you square these trenches? There's a sort of... there are very difficult questions that each side can ask the other. If you are a traditionalist, a modernist will come up to you and say, what about nations who only discovered their identity in the course of the 19th century? It's only in the course of 1850-60 that the Estonians begin to call themselves Estonian, or that the Walloons in Belgium say, okay, the Flemings are calling themselves Flemish, we need some brand too. You know what? We call ourselves Walloon. So finally, they find out some food is cooked, maybe this food is raw. People give themselves a word. We're not Russians, or as intellectuals in Finland said in 1820, we used to be Finns, but that's gone. Now we're Russians, but we can never become Russian. We must find something in between. You know what? Let's become Finns. So very often these identities, which are age-old, as the languages are age-old, only become conscious in the 19th or even 20th century. What do you do with that fact? And again, why does nationalism look the same everywhere? Why do Finns and Basques and Bulgarians and Icelanders use the same political, structures? If they're so very different, if they're all, in their own culture, why don't they do things differently? Fundamentalist religion is very different in Islam or in Protestantism because they do their own thing. But nationalism is the same everywhere. So what explains these resemblances between these national movements? And, you know, if the nation is the people at large, what do you do with a society that is feudal and where the nation at large are just slaves, serfs? Don't you need something called popular sovereignty? Because before you can have anything like nationalism, don't you have to have some democratic revolution, like the American one or the French one, to believe that the people are the sovereign space in the nation? What do you do with nationalism before popular sovereignty? These are very difficult questions to answer. Other way around, traditionalists could look at modernists and say, you think it's all post-1800, so why, you think it's all, you know, triggered by the modernization process, the steam engine and the rise of the middle classes. How come advanced societies like Scotland or northern Spain, where there is industry, where there is a big bourgeoisie, where there is a middle class culture, does nationalism at exactly the same moment that illiterate peasants, storytelling, folk singing peasants in Latvia and in Bulgaria are doing their nationalism? Everybody starts, you know, collecting fairy tales and writing grammars of the language, and this, it doesn't matter what the state of modernity is. It all happens at the same time. Everybody does this in the 1830s. So where is your famous modernity now? And how can it be that cultural groups that are divided between two neighboring countries, like the Ukrainians that were between the Habsburg Empire and the Russians. And in the Habsburg Empire, they were known as Ruthenians. You know, in Ruthenia, they were fairly advanced. This was a modernizing society. In Russia, it was really, really backwards. But they all did the same thing. And they, you know, the Russian Ukrainians and the Habsburg Ukrainians had a lot of exchange going on. And, you know, the state of modernity, it was the culture that united them. So there are huge, big dilemmas that both the traditionalist and the modernist schools of nationalism were stuck in. And then along came Anderson. So Anderson says, yeah, of course it's culture. But what matters is not the culture as such, but the culture as an awareness and the power of culture to mobilize. And while culture is probably there ambiently, like religion, vernacular culture gets a new power of mobilization, a reason why people will take to the streets and have demonstrations and you know, assert it, and that is part of modernity. And it does mean that culture has agency. There is no national movement that does not begin with this cultural awareness and this cultural mobilization. So Anderson steers a very interesting middle course between the traditionalists and the modernists. And I would say that that is because he has a non-essentialist view of culture. The others all had an essentialist view of culture. It's the real, you know, the age-old traditions and the language. And Anderson says, no, it's, you know, it's just what people make of the traditions. It's how people represent the memories. It is how, you know, how magicians make you believe in islands. It's how you experience them. It's the mimesis, the representation to yourself that works. So Anderson, in a way, totally unexpectedly, imports the constructivist notion, the communicative notion of culture, and enriches the tradition of nationalism studies that just hadn't done that up to that moment. And I think that was the great fertilizing moment that he performed. This brings me to what Anderson actually did and what he said. He pointed out that culture is a communicative praxis. And he pointed out most of all to the new communicated form of culture, that is print. He says, why does it happen in modernity? We had books. We see it beginning with Luther in the 16th century, but there's a second print revolution with newspapers and cheap novels, and that really binds people together. So what Anderson calls print capitalism is a huge modern enabler of culture, and it gives culture traction. It gives culture agency. It gives culture the power to transform the situation. It is made available by the conditions of modernity, and it collectivizes what used to be an ethnicity into a general awareness of self. This is the imagined community. People become aware that they're part of a group. In their imagination, they see themselves as being part of people who live and experience the same social conditions. The quotation at the bottom is straight from Anderson. An American will never meet or even know the names of more than a handful of his 240 million odd fellow Americans. He has no idea of what they're up to at any one time, but he has complete confidence in their steady, anonymous, simultaneous activity. He knows that he's part of a larger group, even though he never meets them. And this, one can explain, is made possible as the result of media communication, mad broadcast experiences, and narratives. So it's very important, for instance, for the bonding feeling of a nation to share in a media event. So everybody watching the Eurovision Song Contest or a famous football interland, everybody sits at home, but the streets are empty and we all feel united because we're aware that we're all sharing this moment. And this is the imagined community, the virtual community that Anderson wants to talk about, and this is what he traces. And that makes him one of the three great inspirations from outside the Atlantic tradition, which have rejuvenated memory studies in the past decades. I would just, as a shout out to, in fairness, add to two other important people in nationalism studies, Anne-Marie Thiès in Paris and Miroslav Roch in Prague. They too came from outside this, rut of the Anglo-Saxon school, and I certainly would acknowledge these three as the great inspiration between what I do. Now, finally, what imagined communities is about and how it stands now. Are we okay for time? Okay. These are more or less the chapters that imagined communities roll calls, and I've underlined the ones I'm going to say one or two words about in conclusion as to the present situation. So I've just explained the culturally mediated awareness of each other that we have. Then he goes to the mediation of culture and modernity, looks at the rise of print culture. He turns to the fact that, culture is now vernacular culture rather than Latin or Greek or, one of the great languages, that local people can have their own culture and their own language. But he points out that this happened in an entangled world with multinational empire, and that most of the national activists were born outside the country that they fought for, and very often in a colonial situation. He calls it Creole nationalism. And so the Americas and the colonies and India are very much taken on board by him in his analysis. He looks at the response of states and empires, how they take on board the message of nationality. He looks at the impact in the colonies, looks at the rise of anti-colonialism, and this again is where he shifts from the European view. In the European, Chatham House view, nationalism was a problem. It had led to the First World War in Hitler's chauvinism, and it had led to terrible discrimination and genocide in the Second World War. And Anderson says, yeah, that's the European thing, but it also has liberated billions of people living in the European colonies. They took this as an empowering message, and Indonesia and India and all these other places, became aware of who they were and liberated themselves. So, there's a sort of a good cop and bad cop nationalism. And you can also say that in certain cases nationalism empowers the citizen, even though there is the possibility for xenophobia and racism. So, being the Marxist that he is, he traces the global experience of 20th century upheaval. He believes in revolution and the power of the rising working classes to change the world. He then goes on to the question of memory and forgetting. Now, those two things I will say something about in the end. Memory and forgetting was all an engagement with Ernest Renan, the man who basically started reflections on nationalism with his classic Qu'est-ce qu'une nation of 1882. It had originally been read as an essay arguing that nationality is not a destiny but a choice, a commitment. Then people had emphasized that Renan explained that this choice to live together was based on shared memories. Avoir fait de grandes choses ensemble et d'en vouloir faire encore, having done great things together and to want to continue that story. But he also said, and this is what came up in the 1960s, Well, it helps if the story is simple. You should, and if the memory is vague, because, you sometimes have to allow for a few errors and fakes to be really inspiring. And maybe even traumas are more important than triumphs in bonding the nation together. Now, all these layers of Renan had successively come, on the radar of scholars. But what Anderson was one of the first ones to realize was that you also have to forget. Renan does say it, but people hadn't really paid attention to it. Renan said, if you want to belong together as a nation, there are skeletons in the cupboard. Every family has its family feuds. Every nation is built on brutal power politics. There will be people who have grievances. But if you want to, continue on, you have to let bygones be bygones. And part of the national identity is based on forgetting. That's now a standard word, remembering and forgetting. He was onto this in 1983. Now, that was all remarkably insightful. But nowadays, we have to wonder if history is still as important in nationalism as it was for somebody like Balkenende, who talked about the VOC mentaliteit. At the moment, people do not look to history as much. They tend to look back to times when, toen geluk nog heel gewoon was. The ideal time of Holland was the 1950s. And we don't think that of the 17th century that much more. So here is a question that you might want to ponder. How important are memory and forgetting now? He was ahead of his time in 1983, but how is memory and forgetting now? 2 unconscious deaths I'm going to skip, because we're moving on in the time, but I feel that, he should have really shouted out Ferdinand Tönnies in his notion of community and Jürgen Habermas in his notion of the public sphere, because these people did things that were closer to imagined communities than he himself realized. The final question I would like to leave you with is this. The enabling condition of nationalism and of national awareness in Anderson's analysis is print capitalism. Print capitalism is now dead. Even DVDs are not sold anymore. We are streaming our videos. So what happens to the printed books of Walter Scott? We're way beyond this. The diaspora nationalism that Anderson drew attention to during the Cold War as a feature of, translocal relations has changed its nature, and what he called identity politics are now anti-national. They have to do with sexual identities and other identities, and no longer with the long-distance identities that they dealt with in an anti-colonial thing. And what we have now is the new media. YouTube films, whether they're posted by white supremacists in America or by ISIS, fighters in the Middle East, are the propaganda weapon of choice. Tweets, blogs, Instagrams, all these things are now the cutting edge of where ideas and images of the nation are being mobilized. And I wonder, so long after the disappearance of Marxism, what Benedict Anderson would have made of a nationalism after print media. I leave that for you to ponder. Thank you very much.